This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast about mental health and well-being, hosted by Jeremy Godwin. Let's talk about mental health, because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Let's Talk About Mental Health, a podcast all about mental health and well-being. I'm Jeremy Godwin, and I'm very glad that you could join me again. This week, we're going to be talking about overthinking. We'll be talking about why overthinking happens and how to tackle it head-on for better mental health and well-being. So, let's get talking. Overthinking. Most of us have done it at one time or another, and it can be a real bastard when you're stuck on a thought about something that you just cannot get out of your head. And it's even worse when you try to get it out of your head and then that ends up making it 10 times worse. Most of the time, it's just like getting a song or a movie quote stuck in your head like an earworm. Just a quick side story, I drove my partner and our best friend nuts in 2009 when we went on holidays. I could not physically stop myself from saying out loud as we were walking around, "Let's have some fun, this beat is sick, I want to take a ride on your disco stick," over and over from Lady Gaga's Love Game for 3 days. I'm not kidding, 3 days. But I'm not talking, I don't know why I told that story, but here we are. Serious overthinking is very different to an earworm though. At its worst, it goes round and round, like a record. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. It goes round and round in your head, and it can distract you from rational thought that moves you forward. And that's what we're talking about this week. Why it happens, and what to do about it when it does happen. So what is overthinking? Look, we all overthink sometimes. It's when you get hung up on something or you find it hard to get something out of your head. For some of us, it's a more than sometimes kind of thing. In fact, some of the hallmarks of anxiety are excessive fear, worry, and obsessive thoughts. There's a short article with 6 steps to stop overthinking in Psychology Today, and I'll include a link to that in the blog. In that article, it talks about 2 destructive thought patterns which can happen in overthinking: ruminating and worrying. So ruminating is when we go over and over past events in our minds, even though we know that we can't change what's already happened. Worrying is when we go over and over what may or may not happen in the future. And often those thoughts are wildly negative, and we end up thinking that the worst is going to happen. That's what I'm talking about when I refer to overthinking. Whether it's the past or the future that we're overthinking, or both, and that happens a lot as well, either way, it's negative energy that's being expended in our minds, which can often send us on a downward spiral. Often it starts off with a specific distressing thought, and then we can spiral into lots of other negative thoughts. And then even the fact that we're overthinking can itself be another source of worry. Excessive worrying and or rumination can actually be signs of either anxiety or depression, or in fact both. So it's important to get to the bottom of it if it's happening on a regular basis, and to understand what's happening, and then to seek help if needed. If not from a professional, then at least from someone you trust. Now, before we go any further, let me just be very clear that I'm not talking about the odd bit of worry about what may or may not happen, or the odd concern or regret over something that's already happened. That kind of stuff is completely natural, and I don't think that you'd be alive if you didn't do that sometimes. What I'm talking about is when you can't find a way past those thoughts. When you find yourself spending hours stuck in a pattern of negative thinking, when you can't get to sleep at night because your mind won't switch off, or when you wake up in the middle of the night and then immediately start thinking about that random thing that happened back in 1994 that you wish you had have handled differently somehow. That's overthinking. And that's the stuff that needs a proactive approach to get through it, which is what we're talking about today. Having said that, a lot of the things that I'm talking about today are handy for dealing with just the odd and occasional worry or regret, and are certainly things that you can factor in terms of how you manage those. Some examples of things that I'm talking about are that you might find yourself replaying conversations and wishing that you had handled things differently. You might be hung up on a mistake that you made at work. You might be worried about the outcome of a big meeting or presentation coming up, or you might be obsessing about how you're going to tackle a huge number of tasks in a short time frame to meet a deadline. Those are the types of things that I'm talking about. Understanding what overthinking is really important because, like I mentioned before, excessive worry and or rumination can actually be a sign of depression or anxiety, or both. Regardless of how serious the situation might be for you at any given time, being aware of the risks associated with overthinking means that you can be more conscious of it if and when it does happen, and you can put in place strategies early to deal with it before it becomes a bigger issue. Deal with it while it's still a molehill, but before it becomes a mountain. And you know I love a good cliche, so I couldn't help myself. When it comes to overthinking, tackle it early and tackle it often, so it doesn't become a bigger issue. That's the whole point of being proactive with your mental health and well-being, because prevention is better than cure, just the same as it is with your physical health. This is a really timely topic for me because I've been dealing with a bit of a relapse into anxiety over the past few months, and that has seen my overthinking rear its ugly head once again. Now, I only just realized this week that when my anxiety made a return a few months ago at work, in fact, it didn't just return a little bit, it returned with a vengeance. I only just realized this week that even though I have now left my job at the end of August, it still hasn't just magically disappeared. And I know that might sound really obvious, but it's one of those things that when you're in it, it can be very hard to see the forest for the trees. It can be hard to see that bigger picture when you're experiencing, that sort of heightened emotion. I naively thought that leaving my job and focusing all of my energy on my writing and podcasting would push the anxiety away because I was doing stuff that I loved, even though I definitely know better. And I would never tell someone else that it would work that way, so no idea why I told myself that. So over the past few weeks, when some extra challenges popped up as I worked through some stuff at home, just, standard tax and business stuff, it was just regular work that needed to be done, but for some reason it tipped me over the edge. And I wrote the bones for this podcast on Wednesday, and that morning I went into a total meltdown in the car as I was driving my partner to work. I don't even know what it was, just one thing tipped me over the edge, if you like, and all of a sudden all of these fears and insecurities just came babbling out in this 25-minute car drive. I'm really thankful that I wasn't alone when it happened, and once I got it all out, I was able to talk through options. And look, by 10 a.m. on Wednesday, I'd actually sorted out what was a pretty minor issue that is what had set me off. For me, part of what happens with me in terms of anxiety is I get so overwhelmed with even just basic stuff that I either explode thanks to all the overthinking, or I just go into total shutdown mode and nothing gets done. Or I end up eating my feelings, which is a whole other issue. So that, for me, is the reason why overthinking is a topic at the moment that actually turns out to be quite close to my heart, because it's been one of those weeks. Let's just call it that, shall we? At its core, overthinking is a defense mechanism, and it's our mind that is trying to look out for us. And look, it may be going the wrong way about it, but that's what it's trying to do. There are lots of different notions about what sets this off. But one of the things that we do know is that multiple parts of our brain can set us off, and they seem to drive our fear responses and anxiety. If you're interested in some of the brain science behind this, there's a really good article about the latest theories and how the brain deals with anxiety from Brain Facts, and I'll include the link to that in the blog. If you'd like to read a little bit more about it, go for your life. For many of us, when overthinking goes beyond just the occasional occurrence and it goes into overdrive, it can be exhausting. Like everything, it feels different for different people. For me, it's like being on edge for a really long period of time, and then eventually I either explode or I just crash, and either way I then find I can't function for a while. However it might manifest for you or for your loved ones, overthinking is usually a symptom of stress, and it's something that can be managed over time with the right tools and the right support. Fundamentally, overthinking is a symptom of stress. I mean, let's be honest here. When you're feeling calm and happy, you don't tend to overthink that often because you're busy being calm and happy. However, I think we all know that our emotions are fleeting, and happiness is never a permanent state because nothing is permanent. What's important to focus on is how you tackle the crappy feelings if and when they happen. Like a lot of thought patterns related to anxiety, overthinking can be short-circuited by confronting that terrible C word that's responsible for so much self-inflicted suffering: control. Now, we like to think that we have a lot of control over our own lives, but the reality is that we only have control over ourselves. In other words, how we think, how we feel, and how we act. Often, when we're in overthinking mode, we're stressing about something that is out of our control. For example, how people might perceive us, or what may or may not happen, or that thing that happened months or years ago. When this happens, we need to be blunt with ourselves because sometimes you're just wasting energy on stuff that you have no control over. When it comes to the past, you have no control over it because it's already happened and it can't be changed. Deal with it, get over it, and let it go. It's done. Just remember to learn from it so that you don't do it again. Now, if you made a mistake, check out my podcast and blog from a couple of weeks ago for tips on how you can work through it in detail in order to learn the lesson. When it comes to the future, you have limited control over it. In fact, you pretty much only have control over what you do, say, and think now, which is what shapes the future. And even then, nothing's guaranteed. All you have is now. Plan for the future by all means, but you don't live there. You live here now. So live here. Live now. All right then, let's talk about specific steps that you can take to deal with overthinking if and when it rears its ugly head to rain on your parade. There are a few different things I'm going to go through. So let's get started with what you can do every day to prevent yourself falling into overthinking patterns. And then we'll talk through steps that you can follow if you find yourself in the middle of an over-think-a-thon. Let's begin with stuff you can do every day to proactively manage your mental health and well-being if you're prone to overthinking. First, let's talk about awareness. This is the most important piece of advice that I can offer, which is, if you're prone to overthinking, be aware of that and put in place daily practices that can help you to build your resilience, such as gratitude practice, reflection, journaling, mindfulness, the list goes on. So find what works for you and try multiple things, because the more you try, the more proactive you are, the greater the chance that you'll reduce the instances of falling into the overthinking trap. And why is that so important? Because, as I've said many times, prevention is better than cure. Some of the other things you can do every day to manage yourself are asking for support. So if you're prone to overthinking, don't feel that you need to go through that alone, because you don't. Find a counsellor or therapist who you feel comfortable with and talk it through with them on a regular basis. Or ask for support from a loved one and talk to them regularly, not just when you're in overthinking overdrive. And talk about what is worrying you. Just remember that a conversation is a two-way street, so don't forget to talk about how the other person's doing as well. If you would rather just unload all of your worries and fears, that's where a conversation with a professional can serve you better, because it can be all about you and without any guilt or remorse. Another thing I would say to do to be proactive here is to accept yourself. Don't be tough on yourself. Take things one day at a time and know that you're doing your best. If you like daily affirmations, then go and affirm the hell out of yourself. Do whatever works for you. You need to treat yourself with kindness. As RuPaul says, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love anybody else? All right, so those are some tips for how to be proactive. But what do you do if you find yourself slap bang in the middle of an overthinking marathon? Here are some steps that you can follow in the moment. First, acknowledge it and accept it. Don't try to pretend that it's not happening. Face it head on and acknowledge that you're in overthinking mode and accept that that is the situation. And remember that it's happening because your mind is trying to protect you. It's just going a really funny way about it. If you do find yourself overreacting, overthinking, recognize that it's happening. Pause. A good technique to use here is just slowly counting to 10. Acknowledge that what is happening is a defense mechanism. Accept it and thank your mind for looking after you. Breathe slowly. Now, a good technique to use to calm yourself down is square breathing. If you're not familiar with that, it's where you breathe in slowly for 4 counts, hold the breath for 4 counts, exhale slowly for 4 counts, wait calmly for 4 counts, and then repeat again. And do that several times, over and over, until you feel calmer. Next, I'm going to talk about alternative views and alternative thoughts. So if you're in the middle of an overthinking session, ask yourself, what's a different way of looking at things? What are some other ways that you could come at the problem? And if it's really bad and you just can't stop overthinking, short circuit yourself out of that situation by putting yourself in a completely different setting. Go outside, go to the kitchen and make a cup of coffee or tea, put on a TV show if you're able to. If you're going to do that, don't put something serious and dramatic or horror on. Put on preferably a favorite comedy, because it's an immediate shift in gears mentally towards positive energy. I use The IT Crowd, which is one of my favorite shows of all time, and it works for me probably 9 times out of 10. If that doesn't work, go throw yourself in the shower. Whatever you do, just do something to mentally and or physically short circuit yourself so that you can change your energy. And then once you've done that, breathe through that. And that's where square breathing can come in handy again. Thirdly, allow yourself to run out of steam if you need to. If it really won't stop, sometimes you just need to get the overthinking energy out of your system. Find someone to talk to, or if there's nobody around to talk to, write it down and just keep on writing until you run out of steam. If you're a more structured person, it might help you to set a timer for, say, 5 minutes or 10 minutes and just allow yourself that time to get out all of the worry and concerns before you then push yourself into problem-solving mode. Now, just a note here, if you do have someone to talk to, but you don't want them to see you in this state, that's totally understandable because this is pretty vulnerable stuff. But I challenge you to push past that and talk to someone supportive if you can. Nothing quite matches the sensation of feeling truly heard and truly understood. And while it won't fix everything immediately, it will make you feel just a little less manic if you're in serious overthinking territory. The next step is to assess. So once you finally run out of steam and are starting to feel a little calmer, now you need to assess what you've been overthinking about in order to determine if it's in your power to change the situation or not. Can you change it? If so, change it. If not, you need to accept it or let it go. Those are your only options. This point applies to pretty much everything in life. If it's within your control, do something about it. If it's out of your control, all you can do is change your approach, your mindset, and all your actions. And finally, ascertain what the lesson is for the future. I know I went a bit crazy with all the A words here, but anyway. So ascertain what the lesson is for the future. I've said it 1,000 times before, and I'll probably say it 1,000 times again just today. If we don't learn from the past, we're doomed to repeat it. So when you're feeling in a better headspace, take some time to reflect on what it was that triggered the overthinking and consider what you can learn from the experience. Is there something that you could do differently? Is there a specific trigger that you need to be aware of? Is there some support that you need from either loved ones or a professional in order to work through issues that push you into that place, or to work through stuff that you need to let go of? Whatever the lesson might be, identify it and learn it. So, when it comes to the topic of overthinking, here are a few tips that I'd like to leave you with as I get toward the end of this week's episode. First, be gentle with yourself if you're prone to overthinking. Nobody is perfect, and it's not a sign of failure to get into that headspace. Second, put in place actions every day to proactively manage your health and well-being to reduce the chance of going into overthinking mode. And third, ask for support. You don't have to go it alone, and getting help from someone that you trust can help you to get to the bottom of things that might be worrying you so that you can begin to process and let go. So as always, I'm going to close out with a quote that I'd encourage you to reflect on. So take a few moments and really listen to this quote and give it some serious thought and consideration about what it means to you and how it applies to the topic of overthinking. This quote is from Winston Churchill, and I particularly love it because it really demonstrates that things are usually a lot worse in our minds than what they actually are. Churchill said, "When I look back on all these worries, I remember the story of the old man who said on his deathbed that he had had a lot of trouble in his life, most of which never happened." Let me repeat that one more time. When I look back on all these worries, I remember the story of the old man who said on his deathbed that he had had a lot of trouble in his life, most of which had never happened. Alright, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. To summarise, overthinking can rob you of your present because you're too worried about the future or you're caught up in thinking about stuff from the past. Let it go and give yourself permission to be free of whatever it is that's weighing you down. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I hope that you found it useful. Next week, we'll be talking about taking chances. In the meantime, you can find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest at LTAMH Official. That's LTAMH Official. Or head over and read the blog and other content on the website, letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. Sign up for the blog on the website, and every Friday morning you'll also receive the Mental Health Talk newsletter, which is full of general information about good mental health and well-being, and because it's a Friday, bits of fun as well. That website is letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. Thank you again, and talk to you next week.